You know, each language has a story. They come out of something else, they become something new, they divide into dialects, sometimes sprouting new languages, or they mix with other languages, become hybrids, and create something new again. And the Welsh language, a Celtic language, on the west coast of Britain, Wales, is no different. It has an amazing story, related to German, Greek, Persian, Hindi, but it's Indo-European, so it came from Central Eurasia, basically. And what's that story? I mean, how did it get from Kazakhstan all the way to being Welsh on the western fringes of the European Atlantic seaboard? Well, that's what this video is about. I'm Benjamin, and let's jump into this video, the history of that amazing journey of a language that evolved over several thousand years. The story of how we got from the Proto-Indo-European language to the Welsh language is a remarkable one. That most of the surviving Celtic languages are not even on the European mainland would seem utterly absurd and laughable if I went and talked to someone in the year 400 BCE, when Celts were emerging as the superpower in trade across the northern European continent. So how did this language evolve out of prehistory into Welsh? As I noted in my video on the Indo-European homeland, it is debatable where and when the Indo-European language arose. What most of us can agree on, however, is that the Yamnaya culture of southern Russia and Ukraine, or what is called the Pontic Steppe, was the military force that brought it into Europe from Eurasia, beginning around the year 2700 BCE with the gradual vanishing of the pre-Indo-European Cucuteni culture. See my video on that one if interested. But what made this Yamnaya culture so devastating to its competitors did not begin in Yamnaya lands. To the northwest of the Yamnaya and the Pontic Steppe, in the southern tip of the Ural Mountains, was a culture we call Sintashta, and it was probably related to Yamnaya, maybe even branched off of it. We don't know. What we do know is that it came out a bit later, around the year 2100 BCE, and it is here that something remarkable happened. Two things fused together to create a military expansionism, or allowed it rather to become a superpower: the smelting of bronze in weapons and the domestication of the horse. This position in the Ural Mountains was ideal. It had all the resources and metal needed, and quick running water, and immediately to the south was the native landscape of the horse. Although the horse came from North America, but that's another story. At the time, they were on the Pontic Steppe and the steppes of Eurasia generally, and so these people were perfectly positioned to take advantage of both these inventions, the chariot and weapons made of bronze, together at the same time, which made them a supernova, an unstoppable military force that pushed west out of the Yamnaya culture, which used it and harnessed its power, into Europe. But they quickly moved down the Danube and established new cultures in Oltenia, creating the Kotsofeni culture, and then up the Danube, creating the Baden and then Vucedol culture. See my video on this. This was not immediate. This took a very long time, a process of 1,000 years moving up the Danube gradually into Germany. This was not the only road into Europe. There would have been peoples going back and forth. It wasn't just purely one group of people moving in up the Danube or across the North European plain, as many did, which formed Balto-Slavic and then Germanic and other groups. But for our conversation, Italo-Celtic, these moved up the Danube, and eventually, after 1,000 years of migration, slowly settling this land. Unfortunately for those who were here before, those who held the upper Danube held a prime position, access to major rivers, the Danube, the Rhine, and the Rhone, and it was Celts who held this. Now, the Italics would have been on the eastern end of this group, but they broke off and moved south. I suppose if you want a holiday in the sun, that's the thing you do. But the Celts came to dominate this area in southern Germany around the Black Forest and these areas, which is an extremely powerful position to have during the Bronze Age because of the access to metals, trade, furs, everything you need. Now let's step back out and look at these languages. Most people would laugh if you said Celtic came from the mainland center of Europe. Well, it did. It grew up between Italic and Germanic, on the continent, in the center of Europe. However, you can see from all of these languages, we came from Eurasia somewhere. Celtic would not have grown out of the British Isles. It was just at the edge of the frontier, and so the British Isles would naturally be what it expanded into. However, for the time being, Celtic culture occupied this arc on the northern side of the Alps, with the Jura Mountains, in present-day France, Switzerland, extending into the Rhone Valley, up the Rhine Valley and into the upper Danube Valley. This was a fantastic position to hold in the early first millennium BCE. And in the middle of that millennium, Celts used it to expand using trade and war. It is debatable when Celts moved in to Britain and Ireland, but they did so. They also moved into Spain, and as they were doing so, perhaps partially before and partially after, the Celtic language they spoke was breaking apart, and different groups came into Britain and Ireland with different phases of this Celtic language. Those who were more conservative culturally were on the western fringe. They hadn't been absorbed into this changing culture yet, because the core Celtic culture, with its material culture, its aesthetic innovations in art, its more stratified social caste, its language would have changed faster. And so the P Celtic came from that group. And whilst the Q Celtic had Ireland, it would have also settled in parts of southwest Britain as well. There's a tribe called the Debuni that existed in Britain before the Romans, and they might have been Q Celtic surrounded by P Celtic, which had expanded. And Rome probably came at a time when P Celtic was on the verge of taking over, perhaps moving into Ireland or Spain, but Rome broke the Gauls, who were the emerging superpower of their day and the center of the Celtic world. Celts would have looked toward Gaul as the prestige culture, and these groups, the Belga, the Helveti, Pannoni, Cisalpini, they would have had dialects, if not Celtic languages, of their own, or emerging languages. This was a dialect continuum. But for P Celtic and Q Celtic, and relevant to our discussion, Welsh is the descendant of the group that was innovative and expansive and, dare I say, a bit imperialistic. We wanted to grow and expand our lands, and so we fell into P Celtic, not Q Celtic. The innovators, we were. But Rome came and smashed the Gauls, the center of our Celtic world and the P Celtic cultures. And this broke us. It was like breaking the center spoke of a bike that holds the rest together, and the wheel would be unstable. And here in Britannia, the imperial government set up provinces which divided this island, and they brought in troops from Dacia, present-day Romania, Italia, Iberia, and these would have changed our language in ways that it's probably difficult for us to understand today. You had groups of armed men holding the urban settlements, whilst the local population was in the rural countryside, unable to do anything other than join them if they wanted advancement in life. and Romanization, Latinization would have spread out from the southeast and along the east coast, extending inland and outward from city settlements. But as for our Welsh language, and what we are a descendant of, the British language, as noted by Kenneth Jackson in his magnum opus, Language and History in Early Britain, the British language before Rome had already been breaking up into dialects that were very distinctive. What Roman rule did was drive Latin between the cracks that were already there and force it further apart. So P-Celtic in the Roman era was on a continuum from Gaulish, which did not just vanish overnight, see my video on that, through Brittany, which spoke a language called Armorican, which would be between British and Gaulish essentially, and then up through Britain. The peninsulas divided fastest, with East British would have probably been more conservative, though it would have become much more Latin than the others, going all the way up to Pictish, which was becoming its own language if it was not already. We Welsh come from Northwest British, and we would have spoken the same language all the way from Swansea, here where I am, in Abertawe, all the way up to the south of Scotland. Cornish and Breton, spoken over on the mainland, come from West British. But let's jump back to Gaulish for a minute, because Welsh was undergoing the same kinds of changes. So before Julius Caesar came, and Julius Caesar's genius perhaps was to be able to foresee that if Rome did not stop Gaul before it came together over the next century, that the Roman Republic would be weak before it and smashed itself. Anyway, before Julius Caesar, Gaulish was the lingua franca of an emerging superpower. But under Roman rule, it was entering a bilingual phase from about Julius Caesar's time to about 200 of the Common Era. This was the situation that Welsh, or British rather at the time, found itself in as the Roman Empire was breaking up. However, Gaulish was going through an additional phase that had begun in Britain only in the southeast. Gallo-Roman culture, a new hybrid language, a new Romance language really was actually beginning. Welsh never quite got to this phase, but it was beginning. However, the Franks actually stopped that. They cut us off from Rome in 486, after the capture of the Kingdom of Soissons. We Celtic British, we wanted to be part of Rome at this point. We were so proud of the empire and so loyal to Rome that we have Welsh rulers in the 9th century claiming that they are Roman, wanting to connect with Byzantium to show their loyalty to the empire. We were obsessed with loyalty to Rome as our heritage, to claim validity to rule Britain, and we intentionally try and re-Latinize ourselves several times in several ways. Irish and British split quite a long time ago, and it's debatable because the split in Q Celtic and P Celtic is complicated. At this point I must pop in and note there's disagreement, there's not a wide consensus on when the Celts exactly came to Britain. Some say as late as 500 BCE, others as early as 1500 BCE. I'm kind of leaning towards about 1000 BCE, but we don't know exactly. Because of that, there are different theories, and the P Celtic and Q Celtic divided, but they were still intelligible with each other. They would have been coming up different seaways and up different rivers, okay? So going forward, just keep that in mind. And this P Celtic was changing from the center, and it didn't have time to change everything all the way to the western periphery, okay? However, the break between Irish and British is old, very old, and when looking at Welsh we need to understand that. And anytime you're looking at Welsh you need to understand how different the British and Irish branches of the Celtic languages are. And we went through 4 centuries of Latin imposed on us by a military superpower, a cultural superpower, and above all perhaps, a technological superpower with things like engineering, theatre, aqueducts. I mean, this was like something landed from outer space. Glass windows, though glass windows vanish for a time too, I should add. However, in reference to the Gallo-Roman, like I said earlier, by year 300 some type of hybrid Celtic Latin was probably forming in the southeast, and we were on our way to becoming a Gallo-Romance British language, essentially. But Rome collapsed. The Germanic hordes swept over the border, and this was stopped with the collapse of Britain. And it's important that we understand how bad this was. There was plague. Several barbarian nations came in at once. There was economic collapse. There were slavers from Ireland coming in and stealing people's children. There was famine. City centers were abandoned. It was horrific. And when you have that level of drastic social collapse, new languages almost always come out of that. We had Jutes, Anglo-Saxons, Frisians coming in, and they come into the area precisely where there was probably some type of Romano-British language forming, because those people who had adopted it did not see their culture as being prestigious. And this is interesting because it's the opposite of what happened in France. The Germanic speakers, the Franks, adopt Latin, and if you want a video comparing Franks adopting a Latin language with Saxons not, let me know. But let's carry on. So we have 3 separate languages, separate British languages that have survived out of that: Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, which is across the water. But Old Welsh, arising after the early 6th century, it lasts as British for a long time, a couple centuries, but it's breaking up and changing through this time. We in Wales would be able to understand those in Scotland, around Glasgow, a lot easier in many cases than in Cornwall, because they both came out of Northwest British, albeit some parts of South Wales, specifically the Southeast dialects, which have largely been lost, unfortunately, would be a bit more like Cornish in some cases, like harder consonants, t-t instead of d-d type of thing. And Cornish, the Cornish language, has kept many Saxon words that have completely vanished in English under its influence of French. We in Wales then found ourselves alone because the Scots absorbed out the kingdom of Strathclyde, and that language slowly left us. So we found ourselves alone, as I said, and we did something probably anyone would do. We turned inward upon ourselves, and there was the bloodline of Roger the Great, which split into 2 rival houses. Wales was much less divided in the pre-Norman era than people think it was. It was mostly a civil war between 2 factions of the same royal house who kept fighting over the throne to be the King of Wales. The southeast is a bit different. Morgana Gwent. They're more isolated because of Brycheiniog and the River Severn at this point in history, and their culture is much more Latin. But at one point they nearly take over Wales, however, briefly. They had a 10-year go. And we have a significant injection of Irish into our language from the 5th century, maybe even before, going up to this point. Now they're being absorbed out. They are clearly Welsh speaking by this point, but there's a heritage there, and a lot of our words ending in an or ach, ach or an, many of those come from Irish. Now I show you this map with all these different kingdoms and minor kingdoms to show that there were four major power centers culturally, but also this would have been the major dialect regions of Wales as a country in the early medieval period. Gwyned's Welsh would be much more similar to Scotland, to the Welsh around Glasgow and Edinburgh. Powys Welsh, the Welsh of Powys, would be much more closer to whatever was spoken around Leeds and Cumbria, with Dyfed under heavy Irish influence, and Gwent Morgannwg a bit influenced by whatever Welsh was spoken in Somerset and Gloucestershire and South England. All these kingdoms as well arose because of our landscape. It's so mountainous, not in terms of being really high, but there's no center point around which to consolidate power, so minor lordships arise which create dialects in the language. And with the Norman invasion from the 1080s, we get a massive injection of French into our language, initially to do with architecture and defensive structures, but then it grows into sport, political ideas, music in some cases coming from French, poetry, art. These kinds of words are changing our language, as even the court of Llywelyn the Great in the early 13th century, it appears for a moment that Gwynedd has a shift or a competition between French, this is Old French by the way, and Welsh, Middle Welsh, not Middle Earth. Middle Welsh is the language of the Mabinogi, the poets of the princes, the laws of Hwylfa, and about those laws, and us turning inward upon ourselves prior, the language of it was updated. The poets then are boasting that they speak Welsh. So Welsh clearly wins out, whatever goes on there. But French is entering this language and it's changing it significantly in the 13th century. And then Edward's conquest is slowly changing Wales over the next couple centuries, but you really get the final break into early modern Welsh with William Morgan's Bible in 1588. This is significant. No other Celtic language had anything like this. In fact, Wales was the first stateless nation that I'm aware of that had its own Bible. I do not even hesitate to say that we would not be speaking Welsh today without Sir William Morgan's Bible. It is an astounding masterpiece, and he translated it from Hebrew, the Old Testament, or Torah as I call it. He translated from Hebrew, and the New Testament he took from Greek, and we owe him a great debt, because without this we might have gone the way of Cornish. Being able to read a book in our language and have it be the medium of a religious institution that was in the heart in every village and town saved the Welsh language. But it also set a higher register, became a sort of standard Welsh, though we don't really have that, unfortunately. It became something to measure our Welsh by, and the words in this Bible became the words that people used over time, that slowly, despite all of these many dialects, unified our language. However, not having any other major institutions had its own effect upon our language. There's a word in Welsh called bro, the plural is browydd, and it's difficult to translate into English. I see it often as being translated as area or region, but it doesn't quite fit that. It has a deeper meaning. The distance you can walk and retain a feeling that both the spoken culture and the landscape's memory are local to when you began walking. You have to live in Wales to truly understand this word, actually. But the point I'm making is Wales, from that early modern period until the end of the 20th century, the language begins breaking up according to these browydd, these cultural heritage areas. And it is healthy to have dialects in your language, absolutely. but we lacked institutional authority, and it has left a scar upon our language in making it much more parochial in many cases. However, after this period, and very recently, we voted yes by a sliver for Welsh devolution, that's a limited version of Welsh self-government, in 1999, and now we are seeing Welsh signs across Wales, renewed interest in the language, and growth of Welsh medium education in some areas. Yet, there are disadvantages to having this institutionalism, in that the Boroedd, those cultural areas, are being homogenized by the Welsh institution itself. But it's necessary, in my opinion, and we are entering a new period of Neo-Welsh. And it's so early yet in the history of that we don't know what it will bring. Heroes yr iaith. Long live the language.